We will now begin the joint interactive dialogue. Can you please take your seats? We will now begin the joint interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran and the independent international fact-finding mission on the Islamic Republic of Iran, pursuant to the Council's Resolution 58/21 of 3rd April 2025. I have the pleasure of welcoming the mandate holder, Mrs. Sato, the Special Rapporteur, and the distinguished members of the fact-finding mission, Mrs. Sara, Hossain, Chair, Mrs. Viviana, Krsticevic, and Mr. Max du Plessis. Allow me to recall that on 18 March 2025, the Council decided that the time allocated to mandate holders within the framework of this joint interactive dialogue be 12 minutes for each mechanism, and that the speaking time for the country concerned by this joint interactive dialogue be 6 minutes. The speaking time for other delegations would be 1 minute and 30 seconds. If time allows, more speakers can be accommodated. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I now give the floor to the Special Rapporteur to present her report.
Thank you. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, and representatives of civil society. When I assumed this mandate in August 2024, the human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran was already deeply troubling. I warned then that by the end of 2025, the number of executions could exceed 1,000. In the end, over 1,600 people were executed in 2025. Digital space was already subject to extensive restrictions, with some international platforms blocked and surveillance mechanisms embedded in communications infrastructure. Civic space was already severely curtailed, with laws and policies rendering almost all forms of unsanctioned collective action unlawful. And from previous mass movements, the patterns were clear. Forced confessions broadcast on state television, lawyers defending protesters disbarred and detained, protesters labeled terrorists and mercenaries. What distinguishes the most recent mass movement from violations long reported by this mandate is not so much the nature of the state's response, but the scale of both the mobilization and the repression it has provoked. In connection with the nationwide protests, over 7,000 deaths have been reported by civil society, with more under review. Tens of thousands of protesters were reportedly detained. So too were medical professionals who treated the wounded and lawyers who sought to represent them. What are widely regarded as false confessions were again broadcast on state television. Protests were again labeled terrorists, and members of minority groups were once again scapegoated as foreign agents, a pattern of persecution that long predates the current crisis. At least 30 individuals, including children, reportedly faced the death penalty in connection with the protests. What was new and what has left a profound impression on me was the violation of medical neutrality. Hospitals were raided, wounded protesters arrested from their beds, medical professionals assaulted and arrested. A state directive instructing hospitals to provide information on injured protesters. The result was a healthcare system in which the injured feared seeking treatment more than the injuries themselves, and the act of saving life criminalized. The volume of submissions I received for my report to this council was extraordinary. I received submissions from individuals with no prior history of activism who had never before engaged with my mandate, and they did so at considerable risk. That speaks not to the strength of my mandate, but to the gravity of what people of Iran witnessed and experienced. Mr. President, my mandate exists for the people of Iran. It does not matter who the perpetrator is. When foreign states strike, now for the second time in less than a year, the people harmed are the same people. I have condemned the US and Israel's attacks as unlawful under the UN Charter last year and this time again. The strikes remain unlawful, no matter the assumed or stated objectives of those strikes. International law is not selectively invoked. It applies to all parties in all circumstances. The human cost of the current strikes is already severe. Over 1,000 civilians have reportedly been killed, a primary school struck, and hospitals and World Heritage sites destroyed. Strikes on oil infrastructure have caused toxic environmental consequences with the possibility of serious long-term public health effects. This in a country that was already experiencing acute water shortages. My mandate has long reported serious concerns of treatment of detainees from medical neglect, ill treatment to deaths in custody. Since publishing my report, the military escalation heightened concerns about all detainees, including those arrested in connection with the protests. Families report not being able to reach their loved ones, and worrying reports of acute food shortages, medical care are emerging. Today, 3 million people are temporarily displaced inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. The reported absence of functional air raid sirens and bomb shelters in many urban areas add to the concerns about basic civilian protection during hostilities. The internet shutdown imposed during the nationwide protests has been followed by a second in the wake of the military escalation, cutting people off from information and connectivity when they need it most. I am aware that the people in Iran cannot hear my words despite this session being live-streamed. The people of Iran have endured an astonishing accumulation of violence and loss. A military escalation followed by a crackdown, and then a nationwide protest met with lethal force and mass detention. And before they could draw breath, the military strikes again. They have been killed, detained, displaced, and cut off from the world, caught between sanctions and relentless repression. There has been so much violence and so much death. Mr. President, if we put the people of Iran at the heart of any solution, the military escalation must stop and all parties must resume diplomatic dialogue immediately. Any path forward must be grounded in human rights, the will of the Iranian people, and full accountability for violations of international law by all parties. When the strikes stop, the international community must not look away from what happened in December and the long-standing grievances. The people of Iran continue to be united by a deep desire for a different future, calling for fundamental change. They exercise their right to self-determination. That must be the center of any solution. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the chair of the fact-finding mission to present the report of the fact-finding mission. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies and delegates, I speak today on behalf of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Islamic Republic of Iran and for my fellow members, Viviana, Krsticevic and Max du Plessis. In April 25, the Council requested us to investigate recent and ongoing serious human rights violations in Iran. Since then, we've collected hundreds of evidence items and conducted interviews with 164 victims and witnesses, both inside and outside the country. We've also examined nearly 30 reports from the government of Iran. As you've heard, today the Iranian people are caught between a large-scale military campaign by two countries, the US and Israel, and ongoing repression by their own government in Iran. In this context, we'll provide the results of our work in three groups. First, we'll share information we've gathered on the regional armed conflict and the impact on civilians. Second, we'll update you on our ongoing investigations into the protests that began on 28th December last year and their repression. Third, we'll share our factual and legal findings related to the human rights violations and international crimes that were committed in Iran in 2025 up till December in the breakout of the protests. Turning first to the conflict. On 28th February, the US and Israel launched a devastating aerial campaign against Iran, ostensibly targeting military sites and nuclear facilities. In almost 3 weeks, these strikes have resulted in mounting reports of civilian casualties, including of children. Hospitals, schools, cultural heritage sites, residential areas, multiple oil depots, and a desalination plant have been struck, damaged and destroyed, resulting in severe harm to civilians. On the very first day of this campaign, the airstrikes destroyed a school in Minab in southern Iran, killing more than 168 people, the vast majority of them being girl students, many as young as 7 years old. Against this backdrop, we are particularly concerned by public statements from US officials suggesting that long-established rules of engagement do not apply in this conflict. We will continue to monitor compliance with international humanitarian law of all parties to the conflict and to gather evidence in this regard. This situation has taken place just as the Iranian people have barely begun to emerge from the unprecedented horrors and violence unleashed upon them by their own government, the government of Iran, following the protests that began on 20th December 2025, when millions of Iranis took to the streets across the country, first in relation to the economic crisis and then to demand fundamental change. We have been receiving reports about the killings and injuries that took place in the acts of suppression of these protests. On 8th of January this year, the deaths and injuries escalated significantly, immediately after the government of Iran imposed another internet shutdown. Reports indicate that security forces began to use military-grade weapons, including heavy machine guns, against protesters and bystanders during this period. Credible organizations suggest that over 7,000 people have been killed, far exceeding the government's own staggering claim of 3,117 fatalities over just a few days. Reports indicate that security forces injured people on a broad scale, including by blinding them with metal pellet ammunition fired from shotguns, recalling the shocking patterns we saw during the Women, Life and Freedom movement being suppressed. After the government crushed these protests, security forces carried out large-scale detentions, with credible information that more than 50,000 people were held. They included, as you've heard, doctors who were arrested simply for treating the injured. Victims continue to demand truth, justice and accountability for the violations that occurred during these recent protests and those that have occurred earlier. But we must be clear that justice cannot be delivered through war and can only be pursued through accountability measures grounded in the law. Mr. President, I will now move to the factual and legal findings set out in our mandated report, which concern the period from 18th March to 27th December of 2025. First, in the context of the armed conflict then between Iran and Israel in June 2025, we found reasonable grounds to believe that in carrying out the airstrikes on Evin prison, Israel committed the war crime of intentionally directing attacks against a civilian object, killing 80 people, including at least 1 child and 8 women. Second, Iranian authorities themselves failed to protect detainees held at Evin prison and other places and refused to disclose the fate or whereabouts of some transferred detainees from Evin in acts amounting to enforced disappearance. Third, in the aftermath of the conflict, we found that the Iranian state increased measures of repression to suppress dissent through large-scale arrest, detention and criminal prosecutions. Ethnic and religious minorities were subjected to such prosecutions without respect for due process or fair trial rights. Journalists, human rights defenders, and social media users were targeted for expressing their views on the conflict or merely for calling for peace. Fourth, rather than dismantling its system of institutionalized and structural discrimination, Iran continued to use mandatory hijab laws and rules as a tool to repress women and girls. Fifth, acts of transnational repression against journalists and human rights defenders reporting on Iran from abroad also increased during and after the June hostilities. These included assassination attempts and death threats and harassment of the families of these people inside the country. As you've already heard, executions rose sharply during and after the June hostilities, with an appalling 1,639 recorded during the year, exceeding the global total of known executions for the previous year. Immediately after the strikes ended, in the 3 months between July and September, at least 464 executions were recorded. In the next month, in October, a further 222 people were executed, the highest monthly total recorded in 25 years. The core lesson drawn from our investigations in this context is clear. External military action does not provide accountability, nor does it bring meaningful change. Instead, it risks intensifying domestic repression by a state that routinely resorts to repressive measures to suppress its own people and to suppress dissent. We are deeply concerned that the current security situation may again, as in June 25, be used to escalate repression and to punish those who have dared to express dissent. Excellencies, given the systematic pattern of violations we've identified, practical transformative measures are required now. First, we call on all parties to urgently and unconditionally end hostilities. We call on the international community to de-escalate tensions and resume a credible and good faith dialogue on peace, human rights, justice, and equal and inclusive participation in political and public affairs. There's an urgent need to ensure full respect for international law to protect civilians and critical civilian infrastructure. Second, we call on Iran to cease intimidation, harassment, and arbitrary detention and implement a moratorium on the use of the death penalty. Transformative change is urgently required, one that ensures the voices of all Iranians, including women, young people, and minorities, can be expressed freely and without fear for their security, and that guarantees their ability to participate meaningfully in the public affairs of their country. Third, we call on states to ensure that viable legal pathways, including humanitarian visas, remain open for victims and their families in Iran. Acts of transnational repression should be investigated and those responsible prosecuted. Effective remedies and measures of protection for victims of such repression must be ensured. Fourth and finally, it is essential to preserve evidence of human rights violations and international crimes in the context we've described. There must be a firm commitment to pursuing justice and change through lawful accountability measures and not through violence. War cannot deliver the outcomes that truth, justice, due process, and transformative reparations can achieve. I thank you.
Thank you. In accordance with our practice, we will begin by hearing from the delegations of the countries concerned. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. You have a total of 6 minutes.
Mr. Vice President, today the most urgent and fundamental human rights issue concerning Iran is the imminent threat to lives of Iranian people, whose lives are in immediate and grave danger under the shadow of reckless military aggression. An aggression that is carried out by some of the most lawless and unscrupulous actors on the international stage and by individuals who demonstrate no restraint in killing civilians or in trampling upon the most basic and universally recognized human rights. At this moment, to speak of anything other than these crimes and this act of aggression would itself amount to a grave dereliction of responsibility and a flagrant disregard for the human rights of Iranian people. Today, the Human Rights Council and the Special Procedures mandate holders must speak unequivocally about the innocent children massacred at their school desks. This Council must raise its voice for the people whose millennia-old cultural heritage has been turned into a target of indiscriminate and unlawful attacks. It must also speak for residents forced to breathe air contaminated with toxic pollutants released as a direct consequence of these assaults. Mr. Vice President, for 15 years in this very Council, certain Western countries have persistently advanced unfounded and politically motivated allegations of human rights violations against Iran, thereby laying the groundwork for the very aggression that we are witnessing today. Minor and isolated issues in Iran were deliberately exaggerated and portrayed as grave and systematic violations in order to manufacture a pretext to normalize hostility against Iran. Through sustained political pressure and propaganda, Iran was gradually portrayed as a legitimate target. The carpet bombing of civilians in Iran and the infliction of needless superfluous suffering are the direct consequences of the impunity granted to those who engage in perfidy and repeatedly betray the very principles of negotiation and multilateralism. The invasion of Iran amid ongoing negotiations was not merely a betrayal of diplomacy itself. It was a betrayal of very ideals of human rights and of the conscience of humanity. At the same time, these same deliberately concealed for more egregious violations, including the devastating humanitarian consequences of unlawful sanctions and two manifest acts of aggression against Iran. If this were not the case, why did these countries remain conspicuously silent in the face of the killing of innocent school children in Minab? Why was such a heinous crime not unequivocally condemned? And why the fundamental issue of aggression as the most serious violation of international law and the blatant violation of the Iranian people's right to life has been overshadowed by peripheral political narratives? Mr. Vice President, in recent weeks, hospitals in Iran have been bombed, drinking water infrastructures have been deliberately targeted, and homes have been destroyed over the heads of their inhabitants. Only in the first 10 days of the invasions, near 14,000 civilians units that includes more than 20 hospitals and further emergency bases were targeted in airstrikes. Under such circumstances, what exactly Iran is expected to do? Do those who launched these attacks or those who encouraged, enabled, and facilitated them possess even the most basic understanding of Iran's history, culture, and civilization? Iran is not a nation that submits to coercion, intimidation, or lawless aggression. Today, in the face of the more than 1,300 innocent lives lost and over 7,000 people injured, including a 6-month-old baby struggling for his life, the international community must not remain silent. The families of the more than 300 women and girls who have been killed are looking to the Human Rights Council for justice and for a clear and principled response. If the response of this council is once again silence, indifference, or political selectivity, then it would be the end of the council's stand, after it was severely diminished because of its inaction during the Israel crimes in Gaza. Mr. Vice President, Iran was subjected to aggression while it was actively engaged in negotiations and had explicitly affirmed its commitment to a peaceful and diplomatic resolution. This reality sends a clear and unmistakable message to the international community, and the message is that if reckless militarism, the erosion of multilateralism, and the systematic disregard for genuine human rights are met with silence or indifference, Iran will most certainly not be the last country to suffer such treatment. Finally, I have to reaffirm Iran is resolute in defending its people, its sovereignty, and its territorial integrity. In the exercise of its inherent right of self-defense under international law, Iran will respond decisively to any act of aggression. I thank you.
Thank you. The list of speakers is now closed. I now invite interested delegations to put questions to the Special Rapporteur and members of the fact-finding mission and to make comments on the reports. I would like to remind you that speaking time is limited to 1 minute and 30 seconds for each intervention. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I am pleased to speak on behalf of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. We thank the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their vital updates. We are closely following developments in the Middle East and are deeply concerned about the mounting loss of life. We condemn the dangerous and destabilizing strikes by Iran on civilians and civilian infrastructure across the region. We implore all parties to de-escalate tensions, protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, and prioritize pathways to diplomacy. We fear that Iran's unprecedented response to dissent earlier this year, marked by unlawful killings, arbitrary detentions, disappearances, torture, and internet shutdowns, will only intensify as regional tensions escalate. We affirm the rights of Iranians related to peaceful protests and support legitimate aspirations to decide their own future. Iran's use of the death penalty, over 1,600 executions in 2025, and more than 100 in January 26 alone, is intolerable. We also remain deeply concerned by the persecution of ethnic and religious minorities, including the Baha'i, Kurds, and Baluchis, and by the systemic discrimination women and girls face in public and private life. We call on Iran to halt repression, including transnationally, release all those arbitrarily detained, stop executions, and comply with its international human rights obligations. Question. Medical staff and facilities caring for protesters have faced serious reprisals by Iranian authorities. How can states better support them? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iceland on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic states. During the special session in January, this Council strongly urged the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran to respect, protect and fulfill its human rights obligations. Thousands have reportedly been killed in the violent repression of nationwide protests that began on 28 December 2025, with security forces using lethal force. Thousands more have been arrested and detained, and peaceful protesters have been sentenced to death. This comes alongside a sharp rise in executions, with at least 1,600 executions in 2025. We are alarmed by the reports of widespread restrictions on civic space, continued persecution of women and girls, persons belonging to minorities, and of human rights defenders and journalists. The lack of credible national accountability processes perpetuates an environment of fear and repression for the people of Iran. In this context, the work of the fact-finding mission and the Special Rapporteur is ever more crucial. The ongoing armed conflict has added another dimension to an already profound human rights crisis in Iran. We urge de-escalation, respect by all for international law, including human rights law and humanitarian law, and encourage a return to diplomatic dialogue. Protection of civilians is of utmost importance. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. Vice President, the EU thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for the reports. We are following the developments in Iran and the Middle East with the utmost concern. The hostilities have a far-reaching humanitarian impact. We call on all parties to protect civilians and respect international law, including IHL and the UN Charter. In January, peaceful protesters were responded by the security forces with brutal repression and lethal violence. Accountability is essential. We call on Iran to immediately release all those arbitrarily detained and to stop all executions. Expedited trials for peaceful protesters must be halted. The European Union is gravely concerned about harassment and reprisals, including transnational repression on EU soil. Human rights must be guaranteed for all, including for women and girls and persons belonging to religious and ethnic minorities. We urge full and permanent restoration of internet access. The EU strongly rejects Iran's practice of arbitrary detention of EU nationals, and we urge the authorities to release them. The EU has taken targeted restrictive measures against those responsible for serious human rights violations, and we will continue to do so. We also will further intensify our support to Iranian civil society and human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela on behalf of a group of countries.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Venezuela makes a statement on behalf of the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter. Over the last 14 years, Iran has been subjected to a selective, politically motivated mandate and a confrontational policy of the Special Rapporteur. Iran has been subject of special sessions of the G8 disproportionately, including a duplicated mandate at the 35th special session, as well as a costly resolution of $6.5 million at the 39th special session. This politicization of human rights and double standards are not acceptable. Imposition of coercive UCMs has had a profound adverse impact on the human rights of the Iranian people. Those measures have restricted access to key essential goods and had limited the capacities to design, implement and promote development programs. We condemn the imposition of unilateral coercive measures, as well as repeated threats against the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Iran. We also condemned the military aggression against Iran in violation of international law carried out by the forces of Israel and its allies, which has gravely undermined regional stability and have exacerbated the humanitarian security situation. We reiterate that cooperation, dialogue and equity are the most effective means to achieve shared goals. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bahrain on behalf of the Cooperation Council for the Arab States of the Gulf.
Thank you, Vice President. The GCC states and Jordan condemn the attacks by the Islamic Republic of Iran, which have targeted civilians and critical infrastructure and civilian objects, endangering the lives of residents and the safety and security of the region. Such assaults and attacks that target third parties that are not a party to the conflict are a flagrant violation of state sovereignty and territorial integrity and are a violation of international law and cannot be justified under any pretext. In this connection, our countries welcome the adoption by the Security Council of Resolution 2817 with the sponsorship of 136 states condemning in the strongest terms the attacks against our countries and calling for an immediate cessation. Our countries reject the content of the reports of the Special Rapporteur and the FFM characterizing these attacks as retaliatory or reprisals attacks. There's no legal justification for such assaults, and there's no way to legitimize those illegal acts by virtue of international law. As such, we call on the Special Rapporteur and the FFM and other entities to properly characterize this unjustified and unprovoked assault unequivocally, and we call for full adherence to Security Council Resolution 2817. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mali. Mali, are you absent or is it? If absent, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Albania thanks the Special Rapporteur and the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission for their reports and reaffirms its strong support for their mandates. The findings presented today confirms a deeply alarming reality. The human rights situation in Iran continues to deteriorate at an unprecedented rate. We strongly condemn the excessive, disproportionate and lethal use of force by Iranian security forces against peaceful protesters. The targeting of civilians exercising their fundamental rights to freedom of expression, association and peaceful assembly constitutes a flagrant violation of international human rights law. Albania is particularly concerned about the widespread arbitrary arrests and detention. The persistent allegation of torture, enforced disappearance, incommunicado detention, ill treatment and forced confessions are extremely alarming. Mr. Vice President, these violations are evidence of a broader system of repression and impunity that has persisted for decades. The scale of gravity of the reported violations underscore the urgent need to ensure accountability and end impunity. Albania also condemns the attacks of Iran against the neighboring country. Albania stands with Iranian people and supports their legitimate aspirations for dignity, freedom and full respect of their fundamental rights. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente.
Thank you, Vice President. The Dominican Republic is grateful for the presentation of the report. We note with concern the findings on restrictions to fundamental freedoms and rights, including limits on civic space, the right to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression, as well as reports of disproportionate use of force in contexts of protests. We're troubled by the situation of women and girls and other vulnerable groups. We stress the importance of guaranteeing equality before the law, effective protection of rights. in the international context right now, marked by a deterioration of regional security and by recent escalations of tension generating grave humanitarian consequences, we reiterate the importance of prioritizing restraint, respect for international law by all parties, and protection of the civilian population. In that respect, we stress that efforts to reduce tensions, strengthen diplomatic channels, and promote peaceful solutions are key to avoid further human rights violations and preserve regional and global stability. We urge the Iranian government to continue its efforts to promote dialogue and cooperation with international mechanisms with a view to moving forward in promoting and protecting human rights of all the people in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Philippines.
Mr. Vice President, the Philippines echoes the serious concern expressed by ASEAN foreign ministers over the escalation of conflict in the Middle East. This spiral of armed conflict has already claimed many innocent lives, including those of children. This cannot and should not be normalized. International humanitarian law is clear. Civilians and civilian infrastructure are not military targets. All states have a binding obligation to protect them at all times. Continued escalation poses a grave threat to lives and livelihoods within and beyond the region and to global peace, security, and development, with potentially devastating consequences for all. We are concerned about the safety of millions of migrant workers, including seafarers in the region. We express deep appreciation to the host governments, our close partners, for their cooperation and prompt and committed efforts to uphold their rights and well-being in this challenging situation. We call on all parties to cease hostilities, exercise utmost restraint, and return to diplomacy and dialogue, the only viable way towards peaceful and durable solutions to disputes. We must all recommit to international law and the UN Charter. Respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states must remain sacrosanct, as it is the cornerstone of international peace and security, indispensable for the enjoyment of human rights by all. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We align ourselves with the EU statement and thank the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their updates and crucial work. Iran needs to stop its unjustifiable attacks on neighbors and shipping routes immediately and cease its long-standing abuse of international law, including its illegal enrichment program. In light of the current situation, we reiterate our call for the protection of all civilians in Iran and the wider region, and for the full respect of international law and international humanitarian law. The people of Iran must be able to freely determine their future, without fear of repression, of arbitrary arrests, of sham trials, and excessive punishments, including the death penalty, without fear of the excessive force that the Iranian government has deployed against its own people again and again. Iran must end the abuses against its own population and uphold the human rights of all its citizens, no matter their gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, or religious background. We call on Iran to allow full and unhindered access to HRC mandates. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Thank you, Vice President. France aligns with the EU statement. The escalation in the Middle East must end, and primary responsibility for years is on in destabilizing the region as well as destabilizing international peace and security. France stands side by side with the Iranian people for them to restore peace and accede to a free, decent life. A diplomatic, sustainable solution is necessary to put an end to the war, for Iran to stop being a threat to its neighbors and all the international community. France supported extension of the mandate of your fact-finding mission and of the Special Rapporteur, which are crucial to continue documenting and collecting evidence of human rights violations committed by the regime, especially the brutal repression in January of peaceful protests by Iranians who called only for to be able to exercise their rights. We reaffirm our support and solidarity with our partners in the region, unjustly attacked by Iran, and recall the protection of civilians is an absolute priority as per international humanitarian law. In the Security Council, France sponsored Resolution 2817 calling on Iran to end its indiscriminate strikes against the countries in the region and calls for respect of freedom of the seas through the Straits of Hormuz. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Belgium aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their reports. Decades of systemic repression by the Iranian authorities have indeed led to a catastrophic human rights situation, with many of the violations committed by the government amounting to crimes against humanity. We condemn them in the strongest terms. We urge the authorities to immediately stop silencing this dissent and shielding perpetrators from responsibility and instead release all persons arbitrarily detained, establish a moratorium on executions and the internet shutdowns, and ensure accountability for victims and their families. The recent escalation of hostilities is further exacerbating the human rights situation. We call for immediate de-escalation, renewed efforts towards a credible political solution and full respect for international law. Iran must comply with Security Council Resolution 2817. IHL prohibits targeted or indiscriminate attacks on civilian infrastructure. All incidents must be investigated, including the reported bombing of a girls' school in Minab. Special Rapporteur, members of the FFM, we urge Iran to cooperate with your mandates. How can the international community most effectively support your work at this critical moment? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Gracias.
Thank you, President. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela expresses its profound concern at the recent special session on the Islamic Republic of Iran, in which, in a climate of clear politicization and double standards, we saw the extension of imposed mandates which lack any legitimacy, consensus or consent from the state concerned. We reiterate that mechanisms that don't enjoy the blessing of the state concerned, instead of fostering genuine dialogue, in fact become tools for harassment and geopolitical pressure. Those mandates deliberately disregard the reality of the Iranian people, as well as the devastating impact of illegal UCMs, which violate their right to development. Venezuela strenuously rejects the instrumentalization of this council to promote regime change agendas through biased piecemeal narratives. Along those lines, invoking the principle of self-determination of peoples and national sovereignty, we can but repudiate the military action of Israel and its allies against the people of Iran. It's imperative for this forum to restore its constructive, objective nature, respecting sovereignty, territorial integrity and self-determination of peoples as enshrined in the UN Charter. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le
Vice President, Switzerland thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their crucial work. Switzerland is profoundly alarmed by the rapid, dangerous escalation following the military attacks by the US and Israel against Iran, which violate the principle of non-use of force and risk destabilizing the Middle East. A violation of the principle of non-use of force also exists when Iran exceeds the limits of the right to self-defense, which is the case for part of its response. Switzerland calls on all actors to show maximum restraint and fully respect international law. With respect to the situation inside the country, Switzerland deplores the violent repression of the protests in early 2026, especially the use of lethal force. Restrictions of freedom of expression, internet cut-offs and violation of guarantees of due process are also in flagrant contradiction with Iran's international obligations. Switzerland calls on Iran to refrain from issuing or implementing death sentences linked to the protests. Committed to a global abolition of the death penalty, we urge Iran to limit it to only the most grave crimes. Moreover, Switzerland reiterates the particular importance of protection of minorities who could be exposed to heightened vulnerabilities in times of tension. Madam Special Rapporteur, given the current situation, how to ensure accountability for the victims of repression of the protests not be relegated to the back burner? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The situation in Iran and the region is incredibly volatile. We want a swift return to security and stability. We continue to support our Gulf allies in the face of Iran's reckless attacks. The Iranian authorities must not seek, as we have seen in the past, to exploit conflict to inflict further violence on its people. A renewed internet and communications shutdown prevents crucial communications and access to emergency services. As we saw in January, when the shutdown coincided with the most intense period of lethal force, Iranian authorities turn off internet access to cover up human rights violations. That brutal crackdown on protesters marked the most violent episode in Iran's history, and it is a history defined and sustained by state violence. Many thousands were killed. Thousands more were detained or disappeared. The full picture is not yet clear, which is why our support for evidence collection and accountability remains steadfast. As this conflict continues, we are mindful of women and girls and ethnic and religious minorities who are acutely vulnerable and who have faced severe repression since the Islamic Republic's inception. They, as all Iranian people, deserve to live in peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Slovenia aligns itself with the EU statement. We condemn the military escalation in the Middle East, including the use of force by the US and Israel, and Iran's retaliatory strikes across the region, which endanger the lives of civilians and risk serious consequences for international peace and security. Slovenia calls on all sides for an immediate de-escalation and restraint, and to respect international law and the UN Charter. We are afraid that the current conflict sets a dangerous modus operandi, further undermining the international order based on international law and respect for human rights. We emphasize the obligation of all parties to abide by the provisions of the international humanitarian law, to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Slovenia continues to support the Iranian people in their quest for dignity, respect for human rights and freedom. They should be the ones to decide upon their future. We call on Iranian authorities to cooperate fully with this Council, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and his office. In the light of recent civilian deaths, including children, does the FFM see possibilities to integrate protection norms under international humanitarian law, where applicable, into its investigative work on human rights abuses with Iran? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Moldova.
Mr. Vice President, we thank the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for the presentations. Reports reveal that nationwide protests beginning of on December 28 last year triggered a state response marked by unprecedented level of violence, resulting in thousands killed, tens of thousands detained, including children and medical staff performing their duties. We strongly condemn the use of lethal force against the individuals exercising their fundamental rights. The internet shutdowns and the weaponization of digital infrastructure to suppress opposition are very concerning. We further condemn the sharp rise of executions in the last year, and at least 100 additional executions reported in January 26 alone. Persistent and structural discrimination against women, girls, and minorities continued. We reiterate our call for accountability, immediate release of those arbitrarily detained, and a moratorium on executions as a first step towards the abolition of the death penalty. Mr. Vice President, developments in Iran and in the wider Middle East are of major concern. Search for diplomatic solutions while preventing further escalation leading to protracted conflict is of primary importance. We condemn the attacks that undermine the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the countries in the Middle East. We call for ensuring respect for international law, international humanitarian law, and most importantly, protection of civilian population. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their reports. The Netherlands is deeply concerned about the ongoing escalation in the Middle East and urges the Islamic Republic of Iran to immediately cease its indiscriminate attacks across the wider region. We call on all parties to comply with international humanitarian law. Widespread human rights violations persist unabated in Iran. We strongly condemn the systematic oppression of women and girls, human rights defenders, LGBTIQ+ persons, and ethnic and religious minorities. We denounce the alarming number of executions, as well as Iran's practice of arbitrary detention and transnational repression. Respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms must be upheld at all times. We are alarmed that Iran has repeatedly shut down the internet this year and appeal to its government to uphold the freedom of expression, association, peaceful assembly, and to guarantee unrestricted access to information on the internet. Mr. Vice President, we underscore the urgent need for ongoing monitoring and ask that the fact-finding mission and the Special Rapporteur be provided with adequate resources and institutional support to carry out their work. We continue to urge the Islamic Republic of Iran to fully cooperate with both the Special Rapporteur and the FFM. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Romania.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Romania aligns with the EU statement. We support the mandates of the Council addressing the human rights situation in Iran. The Iranian authorities' reaction to peaceful demonstrations, legitimate economic grievances, and demands for equality and justice was brutal, disproportionate, and contrary to Iran's obligations to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. All killings, all violence against peaceful protesters, and other human rights violations must be investigated in line with international human rights standards and those responsible held to account. We call on the government of Iran to cease all executions, immediately release all individuals detained solely for exercising the right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, and disclose the whereabouts and fate of all individuals detained or missing in connection with the protests. Romania expresses its solidarity with the Iranian people and commends their courage to fulfill their aspirations for a more democratic and just society. We encourage the Iranian civil society to continue their engagement for reform and pursue their legitimate aspirations for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. We would like to ask the mandate holders, how can this Council support such efforts? Last but not least, we stand in solidarity with our partners in the region, targeted by Iranian attacks, which profoundly affected regional stability and security. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Italy aligned itself with the EU statement. We reiterate our support for the Special Rapporteur and the independent international fact-finding mission. Italy follows with deep concern the developments in Iran, where respect for international humanitarian and human rights law is now even more paramount, in particular, the obligation to ensure the protection of civilians. We express our solidarity with the Iranian people in this terrible moment, who are already suffering as the human rights situation in the country continued to sharply deteriorate. Italy has long been deeply concerned about the systemic restriction on freedom of expression, persistent impunity and structural discrimination, particularly against women, girls and minorities. We urge once again the Iranian authorities to ensure accountability for human rights violations following the January protests, release of those arbitrarily detained, and guarantee fair trials. We condemn the sharp rise in executions and call upon Iran to establish a moratorium on the death penalty. Madam Special Rapporteur, how can independent monitoring and reliable reporting on the use of death penalty be ensured in absence of official data? I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Burkina Faso.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President. Burkina Faso takes due note of the Special Rapporteur's report. This session of the Council is taking place in a particularly concerning international context, characterized by an escalation in tension and military action by Israel and America, which have taken place since the 28th of February 2026 against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the ramifications that these have given rise to. These developments have triggered loss of human life and significant destruction of civilian infrastructure. We emphasize once again the need to conserve the international legal order and to strengthen the fundamental principles enshrined by the UN Charter. In this connection, my delegation would like to recall that the respect of states' sovereignty, their territorial integrity, and the principle of non-interference in domestic affairs represent an indispensable cornerstone of international
relations which are peaceful and balanced. Burkina Faso remains profoundly committed to the promotion and protection of human rights in their universality and indivisibility. My delegation believes that the Human Rights Council must continue to promote an approach founded on constructive dialogue, international cooperation, objectivity and non-selectiveness. To conclude, my delegation would like to call for a de-escalation in tensions and a resumption of diplomatic channels. The President interrupts.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Yemen.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. My delegation took note with great interest of the report of the Special Rapporteur and the report of the FFM on the human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran and systemic and documented human rights violations. In this context, we reiterate that Iran has been for decades engaging in serious and rejected interference in Yemen's affairs by supporting terrorist Houthi coup plotters, by giving them high-quality weapons, by providing them with experts in armament and oppression, and encouraging to engage in serious violations against journalists, human rights defenders, women, children, including arbitrary detention and torture, enforced disappearance, extrajudicial killing, in addition to attacking UN staff and threatening neighboring countries and international navigation. We strongly condemn recurrent and unjustified Iranian attacks on brotherly Gulf and Arab countries, targeting their civilian facilities and vital infrastructure, as well as attempts to drag the region into an all-out regional war. Finally, we reiterate that it is up to the international community to act immediately to impose respect of international law, state sovereignty, and protecting peoples of the region from further violence. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I thank the Special Rapporteur and the FFM for the continued efforts to address the situation. The peace and stability of the Middle East is of utmost importance to Japan. As a country that respects fundamental values and principles such as freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, Japan will continue to make all necessary diplomatic efforts in coordination with the international community to bring about an early de-escalation of the situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Japan opposes any use of force against peaceful protests and attacks on civic space in the country. We urge Iran to uphold the human rights of all individuals, in particular the right to freedom of expression, including freedom to seek, receive, and impart information, and the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association without fear of reprisal or intimidation. Japan remains open to dialogue with Iran to further exchange views on efforts to improve its human rights situations, including through a bilateral human rights dialogue. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Austria aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur and the FFM for their reports. We are deeply concerned by their findings, which include the killings of thousands of people since the eruption of the protests, the reported arrest of over 50,000 people, including children, women, minorities, journalists, medical workers, and human rights defenders, and the reports on critical conditions in detention facilities, the application of the death penalty in relation to the protests, with at least 30 individuals, including 2 children, reportedly facing execution, the nationwide telecommunications shutdown with internet connectivity reportedly collapsing to approximately 1% of normal levels, the disproportionate negative effects and targeting of ethnic and religious minorities, notably the Baha'i. Those responsible for these grave human rights violations must be held accountable and evidence preserved. In this light, Austria has supported the designation of the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Austria condemns Iran's strikes across the region and indiscriminate attacks against civilian targets in Israel. We urge all parties to the conflict to adhere to international humanitarian and human rights law. Protection of all civilians, particularly women and children, must remain a key priority. Austria calls for immediate de-escalation and cessation of hostilities of all parties involved and return to diplomatic avenues. Vienna stands ready to serve as a venue for negotiations. The Iranian people deserve freedom and the right to determine their own democratic future. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Oman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We hold this interactive dialogue in the light of a critical regional context. Our region is facing lots of tensions because of attacks and the military escalation, and this threatens countries' sovereignty, security, and stability of their people. It has also an impact on human rights and protection of civilians. Based on the above, we denounce all attacks against Iran, and we also reject fully the targeting of the territories of the countries of the GCC and other Arab countries. We call upon all stakeholders to exercise self-restraint, to observe international law, to refrain from targeting civilians, critical infrastructure and civilian facilities. It is important to go back to international efforts that aim at ending the war, returning to negotiations and diplomatic avenues, because this is the only guarantee to preserve security and stability. We need also to create an environment that is protective of human rights and at all levels, be it in the Islamic Republic of Iran or other countries of the region or of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina.
Thank you very much, Vice President. The report presented to this Council describes a reality that can not be ignored. It documents executions, arbitrary detentions and violent repression against citizens enjoying a fundamental right, that of being heard. We're not talking about isolated incidents, we're talking about human lives, men and women who went out to the street with words, with hope, with dignity, and were met with bullets. The report speaks of the death of numerous citizens at the hands of the same authorities that should have protected them, and each of these deaths concerns us because these citizens were not state enemies. They were their own people. They weren't agitators. They were sons, daughters, mothers and fathers. And today we must say clearly before this Council, those lives weren't lost in vain. These are true heroes, heroes because when thousands of citizens are prepared to give their own lives, tragedy becomes an immense testimony to human dignity. Heroes also because they understood that for a human being there is something worth more than oil, gold or money, worth more than any material wealth. Heroes because history has demonstrated once and again that that worth has a force that no army or the strongest repression can possibly cast down. Heroes because they understood and taught us that the highest value is that of freedom. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. Vice President, we reiterate our principled position against country-specific initiatives introduced without taking into consideration the overall circumstances. Mr. Vice President, Sri Lanka is deeply concerned by the rapidly escalating situation in the Middle East and West Asia, which poses a direct threat to the civilian population. We are saddened by the tragic loss of civilian life and condemn any attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. Sri Lanka underscores the protection of civilians on all sides is a fundamental obligation under international humanitarian law. We stand firmly in our commitment to the sanctity of human life and upholding global peace. Sri Lanka reiterates the need to respect the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, which prohibit the use of force against the territorial integrity or the political independence of any state. As a country firmly committed to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states, Sri Lanka calls on all parties to respect these age-old principles, to exercise maximum restraint, and to return to negotiations to prevent further aggravation of this dire situation. We urge all parties to engage in meaningful dialogue and take decisive action to further de-escalate tensions, given the serious threat posed to stability, peace, security in the region and beyond. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Thank you, Vice President. Holding in the Human Rights Council a discussion on the human rights situation in Iran against the backdrop of any absence of a reaction of the Council to the unprovoked armed aggression against that country, which has left numerous civilians amongst civilian casualties, including children. It's not just double standards, it's an out-and-out degradation of humanity and respect for the right to life. For many years, human rights have been used as a pretext for sanctions pressure on Iran, inflicting damage on the government's efforts to strengthen social and economic rights of its population. Instead of dialogue and cooperation, condemnation of UCMs, instead the Council has adopted non-consensual resolutions and multiplied politicized mechanisms against Iran to promote the interests of its initiators. Those mechanisms ignored the position of states, didn't wish to recognize the clear difference between peaceful protest and unlawful extremist actions. Following unsuccessful attempts to destabilize Iran and change the government through protests fueled from abroad, then came an armed aggression, the appalling consequences of which for civilians in the whole region are clear and continue to grow. What's needed is a swift de-escalation of the conflict, which has taken human lives and has caused destruction throughout the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Malta aligns itself with the statement by the European Union and thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their reports. Special Rapporteur, your report presents a stark picture of violations targeting persons exercising their right of peaceful protest that include violations of medical neutrality. The citizens of Iran were also forced to endure days of internet and communications shutdown, arbitrary arrests, and severe crackdowns by security forces. We call on Iran to immediately release all persons detained for exercising their basic human rights. The fact-finding mission report paints a converging picture of systematic state action intended to suppress basic freedoms. Of particular concern is the application of the death penalty on dubious charges and without due process. Women and girls continue to face severe harassment as rules on wearing a hijab were strictly enforced, as well as labeling non-conformists as enemies. Your determination that threats to women's right to life is a foreseeable outcome of a legal system that fundamentally discriminates against women and girls is shocking. We call upon Iran to implement its human rights obligations without delay. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Liechtenstein thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their respective reports. We are deeply concerned by the military escalation in the wider Middle East and call for immediate de-escalation by the conflict parties in order to ensure the protection of civilians and stability in the region. Liechtenstein has over many years supported diplomacy as the primary route of engagement between the parties to the conflict. We are particularly shocked by the attack against the girls' primary school in Minab, resulting in the killing of at least 165 schoolgirls and injuring many more. We welcome the announcement by the United States to launch an investigation into the attack. Mr. Vice President, we continue to be gravely concerned about the human rights situation in Iran, particularly the crackdown of the protests that began in late December, resulting in the death of thousands of persons, including children, and many more arbitrarily detained. We deplore the sharp rise of executions, the serious and ongoing human rights violations, the severe restrictions of fundamental freedoms, the persistent impunity, and the lack of cooperation by the Iranian authorities with your mandates. The attacks by the Iranian authorities against their own civilian population amount to crimes against humanity, and the perpetrators need to be held accountable. The people of Iran deserve to freely determine their political future in accordance with their right to self-determination. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Czechia.
Mr. Vice President, the Czech Republic aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their reports. The repeated use of lethal force against peaceful protesters, widespread internet shutdown during periods of unrest, and the absence of accountability point to long-standing systematic violations of human rights. We are alarmed by the high number of people killed during the January protests and by the widespread arbitrary detention of individuals who peacefully expressed legitimate grievances. Reports of their forced confessions, along with deliberate obstruction of access to information, further exacerbate the crisis. The Czech Republic urges the Iranian authorities to immediately halt the use of force, release all those detained for exercising their fundamental rights, and restore unrestricted access to internet. We urge Iran to meet its international human rights obligations and to take credible steps toward justice and protection of fundamental freedoms. We reaffirm our solidarity with the people of Iran and encourage the authorities to cooperate fully with this Council, including by granting unhindered access to both mandates. Madam Special Rapporteur, members of the FFM, considering the systemic patterns you have documented, what would be the most effective measures this Council could take to support and protect those at risk in Iran? I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. For 15 years, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been subjected to a selective, politically motivated, and confrontational country-specific mandate within the Human Rights Council. The so-called fact-finding mission was established through a hostile process during the 35th special session of the Council, following intensive lobbying and political maneuvering by a number of Western countries. The reports produced under this mandate are compiled in an unprofessional manner and reflect the political objectives of some Western countries, which have a pattern of using self-efficient human rights mechanisms to conceal their ulterior motives. Abuse of UN human rights mechanisms to single out and harass states that do not conform to the hegemonic and geopolitical interests of the West constitutes a grave violation of fundamental principles of respecting sovereignty and non-interference in the internal affairs of states as enshrined in the UN Charter. We urge the HRC and OHCHR to encourage genuine dialogue and cooperation with states, carry out their work in an objective and impartial manner, and to stand firmly against the politicization, selectivity, and double standards of human rights. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Luxembourg.
Vice President, Luxembourg aligns itself with the EU statement. Madam Special Rapporteur, Chair of the FFM, we would like to thank you for the presentation of your respective reports. It allows us to better understand the human rights situation in Iran. Luxembourg is profoundly concerned by the unprecedented military escalation in the Middle East, and we think first and foremost of the victims' families. The Special Rapporteur casts light on a human rights situation characterized by a serious upscaling in repression since December 25. Mention is made of a systematic use of force, arbitrary arrest, and wide-ranging suppression of telecommunications, as well as serious violations of medical neutrality. The rapporteur also highlights a spiraling of the situation since the first strikes of February to March, which have become almost global in scale. We would like to call for the fundamental nature of civilian protection. We'd like to also call on the Iranian government to re-establish access to training and ensure that its obligations in human rights are fully respected, independently of the regional and military dynamic that currently prevails. In the face of the internet and telephone cuts, how is your mission still able to continue its key work and ensure human rights violations are not lost from sight? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Montenegro.
Vice President, Montenegro acknowledged the vital work and insights of the Special Rapporteur and fact-finding mission. Their reports highlight the Iranian people's deepening plight, exacerbated by increasing hostilities within the country and across the region. This situation underscores the urgent need to protect all civilians, uphold international law, and abide by the principles of the UN Charter. The findings detail unprecedented repression during nationwide peaceful protests, with thousands killed and tens of thousands arbitrarily detained. The documented violations, including murder, imprisonment, torture, sexual violence, gender persecution, and enforced disappearance, may amount to crimes against humanity. This reflects a system that criminalizes dissent, entrenches impunity, and denies victims their rights. We strongly condemn the use of the death penalty, with a staggering over 1,600 executions in 2025 alone. This is particularly concerning for women and those charged under the new espionage law. We call for a moratorium on execution, leading to their abolition. We also condemn the targeting of human rights defenders, journalists, and protest witnesses, including through acts of transnational repression. We urge Iranian authorities to end violence, release all those arbitrarily detained, and respect fundamental freedoms. Accountability is indispensable for justice and prevention of future violence. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar.
Mr. Vice President, the State of Qatar condemns in the strongest terms the recent Iranian assaults indicated in the report, targeting territories in Qatar and other brotherly nations with drones and missiles in a flagrant violation of state sovereignty and a direct threat to the security and safety of civilians, and a stark breach of international law and the UN Charter, and an unacceptable escalation that threatens security and stability in the region. We welcome in this connection the adoption by the Security Council of Resolution 2817, which condemns the Iranian attacks in a number of regional countries, reaffirming state sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. The deliberate and indiscriminate targeting of a state that is not party to the conflict, that did not allow for the use of its territories and airspace in combat, represents a dangerous violation of international law. And we reject the content of the two reports characterizing these assaults as retaliatory. Such a characterization lacks a legal and realistic basis and might legitimize hostile action that are considered illegal by virtue of international law. In conclusion, the State of Qatar affirms reserving its full right to respond in line with Article 51 of the UN Charter to defend its sovereignty and security, and we reiterate our call for immediate de-escalation, a return to dialogue, and letting reason prevail to safeguard the security and stability of the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Spain aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks you for the reports you presented. In the face of the seriousness of these events, we believe it's particularly important to hold today's dialogue because this Council must defend international law in all circumstances with an equal robustness. Spain continues to follow with grave concern the human rights situation in Iran and the increase of the application of the death penalty, the restriction of the civilian space, and the persecution of all of the minorities documented in the report. The repression carried out by the authorities against peaceful demonstrations at the beginning of the year, as well as arbitrary detentions and the summary executions of demonstrations, are very serious violations of international human rights law. We also consider unacceptable the restriction on communications, and we're alarmed by the use of medical services as an instrument of repression and control. Spain also robustly condemns violence and repression meted out against women, whose fundamental rights are systematically violated and whose protests have been violently silenced. Iran is the country of Mahsa Amini, let us not forget it, and also the children who were victims of the Minab school bombing. In the face of the war, we reject the unilateral actions of the United States and Israel and their impact on Iran and the neighbouring countries, and we call for the immediate cessation of these. We must return to the rule of international law. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Thank you, Vice President. Colombia notes with concern the deterioration. A few months ago, we witnessed an unprecedented level of repression of popular protests and now use of force against Iran, as stated in the report of the fact-finding mission. and what the Special Rapporteur has said. This has left the Iranian population trapped between a large-scale military campaign and a national apparatus responsible for human rights violations. Colombia notes with concern the increasing deterioration of the human rights situation in Iran as a result of recent armed attacks against that country. This has in turn led to Iranian armed action against states in the region, with equally disruptive consequences, particularly for civilians. Colombia cannot stay silent given the human costs of the situation in Iran and the region. We cannot continue exposing entire communities to fear and to risk, which hampers the situation of the most vulnerable, women and children. No military objective can justify civilian populations being trapped in the crossfire or being victims of indiscriminate attacks, especially on facilities protected under IHL, such as schools. Protecting life should be our top priority. Use of force by all parties involved must end. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
السيد نائب الرئيس مع مرور 17
Thank you, President. 17 days after the start of the Iranian attacks, violent attacks against my country, we commend the adoption of Resolution 2817 of the Security Council to put an end to these aggressions. We refute all justification by Iran of its military attacks. These are just misinformation and propaganda campaigns to conceal the aggression against the Emirates, given that the Emirates, until the last moment, were going to great lengths to prevent this war breaking out. It's Iran who stepped away from the Emirates. We recall also what was said in the report of the Special Rapporteur, and which is completely refuted by us, since these acts are not reprisals. Nothing can justify Iranian aggression against my country. This is a grave violation of international law, given that my country is not a party to this conflict. Iran has even targeted civilian assets, civilians, leaving many victims in flagrant violation of IHL and the UN Charter. The Emirates have a legitimate natural right to legitimate self-defense as per the UN Charter. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Vice President. Ireland aligns with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur and Fact-Finding Mission for their reports, which clearly demonstrate the need for continued monitoring of the human rights situation in Iran, notwithstanding the challenges in doing so at present. Ireland has consistently condemned the Iranian authorities for their violations of human rights, discrimination against women and girls, and the oppression of minority groups in Iran, including the Baha'i and other minority faiths, as documented in the reports, is of particular concern to Ireland. The continued and extensive use of the death penalty in Iran should cease immediately. Ireland reiterates its condemnation of the recent brutal repression of protesters, including the reported deaths of at least 7,000 Iranians and the arbitrary detention of tens of thousands. Iranians should be free to express their views without the fear of violence. Ireland calls on the Iranian authorities to halt all violence, suspend executions and release those who have been detained. Vice President, Ireland recalls that all parties in any conflict must meet their obligations in full under international law, including international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must not be targeted and must be protected. Special Rapporteur, what is your assessment of the potential to strengthen monitoring of the human rights situation in Iran, given the challenges that obtain? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uzbekistan via video.
Thank you, Chair. The delegation of Uzbekistan notes our country's commitment to an open and respectful dialogue with United Nations human rights mechanisms, as well as to constructive engagement with all member states. We believe it is important that discussions of human rights issues within the Human Rights Council be conducted in a spirit of objectivity, mutual respect, and impartiality. In this regard, we consider it is necessary to refrain from the politicization of human rights agenda and to use Council's potential primarily to strengthen trust and promote constructive international cooperation. Uzbekistan firmly supports the settlement of any agreements and disputes exclusively through peaceful means on the basis of norms and principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. We emphasize the unwavering commitment of Uzbekistan to the principles of the sovereign equality of the states, respect for their independence and territorial integrity, and the non-use of force or threat of force in the international relations as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine.
Mr. Vice President, Ukraine thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their important work in documenting widespread, systematic and persistent human rights violations in Iran. The Iranian authorities, which have been mocking the Iranian people for decades, has launched a large-scale policy of violence against its own people and other countries. This includes massive human rights violations within the country, support for militants who have brought chaos to other countries in the region, and direct military support for the aggressor state of Russia in its unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. We remember and will never forget the strikes of thousands of shaheds on our peaceful cities and people. Such cooperation between Moscow and Tehran results in a gross violation of international law and undermines global efforts to restore peace and stability. We confirm the unchanged position of our state. We support the Iranian people and their legitimate desire to live in security, freedom and prosperity. We therefore call on Iran to cease its involvement in Russia's war crimes, uphold its international obligations, and grant full, unrestricted access to the UN Human Rights Special Procedures mandate holders, and fully cooperate with the independent international fact-finding mission. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe.
Vice President, Zimbabwe is worried by the continued politicization of the Human Rights Council and the use of double standards. The current situation in Iran calls for condemnation, yet the Council has remained mum when the territorial integrity of Iran is being violated and civilian infrastructure and innocent people being targeted. We reaffirm our unwavering commitment to the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, including respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of states, and the fundamental principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of all countries. Iran has remained steadfast in its commitment to effectively address the social and economic needs of its citizens in safeguarding the human rights of its people through continued cooperation with the Human Rights Council and other human rights mechanisms. The continuation of the fact-finding mission without the consent of the government of Iran is not only costly but counterproductive in terms of encouraging and supporting the country to effectively meet its human rights obligation. We urge the Council to pursue a path of constructive dialogue and cooperation with the government of Iran. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Vice President, Cuba reiterates its rejection of punitive piecemeal mandates established against the willingness of the country concerned, as is the case with Iran, which have for years proven to be ineffective in promoting and protecting human rights. Those mechanisms, those interventionist mechanisms imposed year in, year out against specific countries, usually from the south, instead of contributing to the cause of human rights, become an obstacle to respectful dialogue and genuine cooperation. Cuba firmly condemns the aggression by the US and Israel against Iran. We call for respect for IHL, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Iran and of all states in the region, cessation of acts leading to human damage and also to the destruction in Iran and the Arab countries. We call for preservation of the principle of good neighbourliness and dialogue at these delicate times. UCMs imposed for decades now have affected the lives of the Iranian people and violate their human rights. Cuba reiterates its rejection of those measures and calls for their elimination. We will continue to advocate promotion of human rights in any country based on dialogue and cooperation based on impartiality, respect and non-interference. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Thank you, Vice President. Chile welcomes the presentation of the reports of the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission. Its findings reflect the gravity of the human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran and the far-reaching human impact that it continues to generate. Reports document profoundly troubling acts, excessive use of force against protesters, arbitrary detention, sustained increase in executions and growing restrictions on civic space. What's also alarming are reports of attacks on hospitals and persecution of medical personnel in contravention of essential principles of IHL and human rights law. Chile reaffirms its commitment to universal promotion of human rights. Stability and development of societies are strengthened when you guarantee fundamental freedoms, when you protect civic space, and when the citizenry are heeded. We reiterate the importance of independent, impartial, transparent investigations to clarify the acts, guaranteeing access to the truth, justice and reparation for victims and bolstering confidence in institutions. We'd like to ask the mission and the rapporteur, what measures do you think are a priority to enhance protection for victims and ensure that evidence collected can contribute to future accountability processes? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ghana.
Mr. Vice President, Ghana thanks the Special Rapporteur and the FFM for the report on the human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran. We are concerned about reports of serious human rights violations, including excessive use of force against protesters, arbitrary arrests, allegations of unlawful killings, torture and ill treatment, as well as restrictions on access to information. Mr. Vice President, Ghana is equally concerned by the rapidly deteriorating security situation in the region and calls on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, cease hostilities, and prioritize dialogue and diplomacy as the only sustainable path towards de-escalation and regional stability. We call on all states to fulfill their obligations under international human rights law, including the protection of the rights to life, peaceful assembly, freedom of expression, and protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We further encourage constructive engagement between the government of Iran and the FFM and Special Rapporteur. We also call on Iran to facilitate access to the country. Ghana remains committed to supporting dialogue, accountability, and the protection of human rights of all people. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sudan.
Thank you, Vice President. As a state that has suffered and is still suffering from the repercussions and effects of conflict, and fully cognizant of such woes, we seize this opportunity to call for a de-escalation in the Gulf and the Middle East and to return to dialogue and the diplomatic and peaceful solutions and international law. All the points of divergence can find a solution. This conflict, which is ongoing in one of the most critical regions in the world, will have negative repercussions on international peace and security, will have dire repercussions on the economy and on the enjoyment of human rights at the regional level and the international level. We call on the Security Council to shoulder its responsibilities and to seek to settle the conflict based on international law, and we indicate the danger of expanding the scope of the conflict, and we call for full adherence to IHL and refraining from targeting civilian infrastructure. We've taken note of the two reports that have been presented and their observations as well as their recommendations, and we encourage Iran to continue its efforts in promoting and respecting human rights, including when it comes to legal reform and protecting the vulnerable and providing social services and preserving civic space. Thank you very much, Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Greece aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the SR and the FFM for their reports. We are deeply concerned by the continued deterioration of the human rights situation in Iran. the unprecedented violence against peaceful protesters since 28 December 2025, resulting in thousands of civilian deaths, is shocking and unacceptable. Reports of accelerated trials and severe penalties, including the death penalty against protesters, are equally alarming and further silence legitimate voices. Religious and ethnic minorities continue to face discrimination, arbitrary detention, and unfair trials, while women and girls experience persistent structural inequalities. Restrictions on communications and internet access further aggravate the situation by limiting the free flow of information and hindering independent scrutiny. Credible investigations and accountability for those responsible are essential. Greece supports international efforts to document abuses in the work of civil society and human rights defenders operating under extremely difficult conditions. Greece also condemns Iranian strikes against neighboring countries and stresses the need for maximum restraint, de-escalation, and full respect for international law. Lasting solutions can only be achieved through dialogue that addresses legitimate concerns, reduces the risk of further violence, and paves the way for a peaceful and dignified future for the Iranian people, while safeguarding international security. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Afghanistan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We expressed our profound concern and condemn the recent aggressions and military strikes against Iran and the expansion of the war in the GCC regions and beyond, which is a clear breach of international law. Such aggressions undermines the UN Charter, the principles of sovereign equality, the prohibition on the use of force, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. We recall that even in moments of crisis, all parties remain bound by international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including the obligation to protect civilians and civilian objects at all times. There can be no justification for deliberate or indiscriminate attacks on schools, hospitals, or other essential civilian infrastructure. Mr. Vice President, we also express concern that this escalation further endangers refugees and migrants from Afghanistan and Iran who already face forced returns, insecurity, and protection risk. We reaffirm that force cannot be substituted for diplomacy and urge all parties to exercise restraint, return to meaningful negotiation, and uphold the UN Charter, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Today's session is being held on the backdrop of the tragic developments unfolding in the Middle East and blatant violations of the UN Charter and international law, including the core objectives of protecting and promoting human rights and humanitarian law. While categorically condemning all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, as well as the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, we urge for the immediate cessation of hostilities. We express our deepest sympathy and solidarity for the loss of all innocent civilians killed by the military attacks, including the young schoolgirls in Minab. Last year, the mandate under consideration had undergone through an unusual renewal procedure, followed by a special session earlier this year, further complicating the mandate that has already been highly politicized. In this dialogue, we would like to focus on the decisions that would emerge from this Council. It is essential that the Council exercises sensible judgment and upholds a strong moral responsibility and avoid divisive approaches in its decision-making. Selectively targeting certain states that are already facing multiple politically driven pressures risks deepening divisions. We remain concerned about the reoccurring practices within the Council, including the role played by certain actors in advancing confrontational approaches. Eritrea encourages the Council to refrain from practices that isolate states and calls for fairness and balance in carrying out its work. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. Vice President, China has taken note of the reports and expresses concern about the use of false and biased information therein to interfere in the internal affairs of a sovereign state. We welcome the Iranian government's efforts in recent years to promote and protect human rights, particularly the rights of women, children, minorities, refugees, and migrants. China always opposes country-specific mechanisms established without the consent of the country concerned and rejects the politicization and instrumentalization of human rights issues. We call on the international community to fully respect Iran's sovereignty and to assess its human rights situation in an objective, impartial, and comprehensive manner. China is gravely concerned that certain countries, without UN authorization, launched military strikes against Iran in the midst of ongoing negotiations, leading to spillover of the conflict to neighboring countries, clearly violating international law and seriously undermining fundamental rights such as the right to survival and development. We condemn all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and urge all parties to cease military operations immediately and return to dialogue and negotiations without delay. Thank you, Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait.
سيد نائب الرئيس يضم وفد بلادي صوت.
Thank you, Vice President. We align with the statements delivered by the states of the Gulf Cooperation Council. We firmly condemn the Iranian illegal aggression through drones and missiles against Kuwait and the states of the region. This constitutes a flagrant violation of international law. I take this opportunity to convey my sincere condolences to the families of the victims, be it in Kuwait or other countries. We reiterate our full, natural, legitimate right to self-defense, and we recall that any threat against one of our GCC countries is a threat against the region as a whole. We welcome Resolution 2817, which shows that Iran has committed an aggression against the region. The resolution firmly condemned the Iranian aggression and called for a complete stoppage to any targeting of civilians. We also refute what was stated in the report, which qualifies the acts of Iranian aggression as acts of reprisals. This is unacceptable since it confers some kind of legitimacy to those acts which are unjustifiable and illegal. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
President, we're extremely concerned by the situation in and around Iran. The US and Israel's actions are a clear, unprovoked act of armed aggression against a sovereign, independent state, UN member state, in violation of its charter and the founding principles of international law, and is a blatant interference in internal affairs of Iran and seeking to destroy this dissenting country. US's actions in Jerusalem have already led to escalation in the whole region and risk becoming a humanitarian economic catastrophe. In that light, it's unjustified by the Western countries to try and justify the aggression against Iran with some kind of threat to international peace and security. We call on US and Israel to immediately end their aggressive actions. We insist on immediate resumption of political diplomatic settlement of the situation based on international law, mutual respect, and balance of interests. We categorically condemn any attempt to politicize human rights, which the Western states have used as instruments to confront dissenting states that dissent from their line on various trumped-up pretexts. The West continue to seek to destabilize the situation in those countries that stand against them, using politicization of human rights discredits this council, and we call on them to refrain from this destructive practice. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Vice President, Ethiopia believes that multilateral forums, including this Council, play a vital role in fostering cooperation among states in fulfilling their human rights obligations. In this regard, we emphasize the importance of constructive engagement, dialogue, and mutual understanding in advancing the promotion and protection of human rights globally. Ethiopia acknowledges the engagement of Islamic Republic of Iran with international human rights mechanisms. In this respect, we encourage Iran to continue its cooperation with relevant mechanisms, including the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as its constructive participation in the Universal Periodic Review process and the implementation of accepted recommendations. Ethiopia remains firmly committed to the principle of universality, objectivity, and non-selectivity in the work of this Council. In closing, Ethiopia underscores that enhanced cooperation with the states, support for nationally led initiatives, and the promotion of constructive dialogue, technical assistance, and capacity building undertaken with the consent of the concerned state are essential for sustainable promotion and protection of human rights. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Malaysia thanks the Special Rapporteur and the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission for their continued work. Malaysia remains deeply concerned by reports of attacks on civilian infrastructures, including the strikes on the girls' schools in Minap. Attacks on schools are particularly alarming and must be unequivocally condemned. Schools are civilian objects and must never become targets of violence. The protection of civilians, especially children, must remain paramount at all times. Educational institutions represent more than physical infrastructure. They are essential spaces that safeguard children's right to education and their future. When schools are damaged or destroyed, the consequences extend far beyond the immediate loss of life, undermining stability, recovery, and the long-term well-being of affected communities. Malaysia therefore underscores the importance of full respect for international law, including international humanitarian law, particularly the principles of distinction and protection of civilian objects. In this regard, Malaysia encourages the Special Rapporteur and the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission to closely examine allegations of attacks against civilian infrastructure and their implications for the enjoyment of human rights, particularly the rights of children, and to ensure that the findings are duly reflected in its forthcoming report. Accountability and credible documentation remain essential to ensuring protection for civilians, including children, and preventing further violations of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Niger. I believe the delegation is absent. This is the last speaker on the list. We shall now turn to the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. I now give the floor to the representative of Amnesty International.
Amnesty International comes before the Council with one urgent call. Amid an armed conflict, we must stay focused on the human rights of people in Iran. They live under a repressive system that relies on massacres to crush dissent and demands for fundamental political change. Now people are caught between threats of further deadly repression and an armed conflict involving serious harm to civilians. Meanwhile, the government maintains an internet shutdown. Civilians in Iran are on a dual atrocity trajectory. For demanding transition and human rights, they are met with crimes against humanity. Iran's constitutional structure entrenches discrimination and impunity and denies people the internationally recognized rights to take part in public affairs and freely determine their political destiny. Now, civilians also bear the brunt in armed conflicts, as tragically seen in the killing of over 100 children in an Israeli-US strike on a school in Minab. With violations of international humanitarian law and systemic impunity for repeated crimes under international law, including during successive protests, a wait-and-see approach is devastating for the people of Iran. We urge states to urgently initiate a comprehensive international framework to end violations and deliver justice and rights-respecting transformative pathways for the people of Iran. What actions do the mandates consider necessary in this relation? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Organization for Defending Victims of Violence.
Thank you, Mr. President. The recent aggression by Israel and United States on Iranian territory are not mere geopolitical escalations. They are blatant violations of international law. Madam Special Rapporteur, we appreciate your recent press release calling for de-escalation and accountability. However, the international community must realize the words alone cannot stop the spilling of civilian blood. We need immediate action. We are witnessing a brutal attack on innocent lives. Homes, hospitals, and civilian infrastructure are being targeted one after another, leaving millions of people in danger. The most heartbreaking example of this brutality is a horrific massacre in Menab. Schoolgirls just 7 to 12 years old were brutally killed right inside their classrooms. These children are not collateral damage. Their tragic deaths are clear war crimes that demand global outrage. Beyond physical destruction, the relentless bombings are inflicting severe psychological trauma and paralyzing anxiety upon our children and vulnerable communities. We urge the international community to break their silence, stop the shocking and endless crimes of the US and Israel, and hold them accountable before more innocent blood is spilled. We strongly urge these two mechanisms to immediately launch an investigation into all crimes committed against Iran and Iranians since February 2026. I thank you.
Thank you. This was the last speaker we could accommodate. Excellencies, distinguished participants, this brings us to the end of this meeting. We will reconvene in the afternoon at 2:30 p.m. to continue the joint interactive dialogue on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran and listening to the High Commissioner's oral updates on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, followed by general debate under item 4. I hereby close the 32nd meeting of the 61st session of the Human Rights Council.
Thank you. So I guess we do on 2:30.
Yeah.